Hello, everyone. Today's guest is Bart Vanderhaegen. Bart is a business consultant and has created his own management method called problem-based management, which is grounded in critical rationalism. He uses it to help organizations streamline their operational performance as well as improve their commercial effectiveness. Bart has also given a TED Talk on the concept of flow, and he hosts the Seeking Good Explanations podcast, which covers a wide range of topics from economics to physics to personality. Bart and I are kindred spirits. We often discuss the nuances of critical rationalism and how it relates to problem solving. Bart focuses more on the business problems, and I focus more on everyday life problems. In today's episode, we'll dive into the different steps and nuances of problem solving and highlight what works and what doesn't work. I'm really excited to have this conversation. Bart, welcome to the show.
Hi, Edwin. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm a follower of your podcast, so happy to have this discussion.
Great. At a fundamental level, businesses exist to meet the demands of customers and shareholders. So that demand is met through continuous value creation and delivery, and that value comes from the people that work in a company. So improving a business ultimately means improving how people create value. And some argue that the answer is in strict planning, working harder, or hiring the right people. But I think you have a different take on what the really important aspect of an organization is to focus on.
Yes, so I've spent years thinking about improvements and approaches of management, and I went through the various different ways of approaching management. So typically you have the hard and the soft methods. Like the hard methods are the ones that focus on processes, on measurable KPIs, on adherence and control systems. And then the soft approaches focus more on people and emotion and well-being. And so that took me, like most of us, a lot of time to visit back and forth between those two areas until discovering the books of and the works of David Deutsch and Karl Popper, and really the domain of epistemology, the domain of what knowledge is, how it is created, how it grows, and then coupled with the idea that everything that happens in a company, every transformation, every creation of value for a customer is ultimately caused by knowledge. So all actions require knowledge for what to do, what the consequences of those actions could be, what the desired results of those actions could be, how to change an action, correct it, improve it. All of those elements require knowledge. So knowledge is the kind of primal causal factor. And if you take that seriously, then obviously you want to know how knowledge works, because knowledge works in a different way and has different dynamics than, for example, measurements or people as a whole or emotions. And so that got me into this kind of rabbit hole of trying to come up with a management approach that takes what I've learned from the various fields, but puts it under a kind of solid theory of knowledge, which is epistemology, and in our case, critical rationalism.
What actually got you into critical rationalism in the first place?
Yeah, so sheer coincidence or luck. It was just a friend who recommended the book, The Beginning of Infinity of David Deutsch. He didn't say a lot about what it was about. He just said, you're going to be amazed. You're going to be flabbergasted by all of what is covered in there. And so I took it to faith and I started reading, and yeah, I could never let it go. I mean, I think by now I have read it like 4 or 5 times already, and I still keep rereading it and playing with the ideas, trying to understand them, trying to get even more consequences out of all those many ideas. But in the beginning, it was just a friend recommending a book, and we ended up disagreeing actually over the content, but that's some side consequence. I'm very grateful to the person for having recommended me the book. So that's how I ended up
Interesting.
doing all of this.
Before that, did you have already like your own problem solving methods, and were you already a business consultant applying different methodologies and framework?
Yeah, I was into like workflow tools and a bit like project management tools. I thought that was something that was lacking. I used to work for a strategy consultant, so that was a lot of slides and a lot of data analysis and a lot of theory. And quite quickly I was concerned already with the question, but how are we going to implement this, and how do you coordinate implementation, and how Do you resolve bottlenecks in implementation? So I was on to workflow, project management tools, online tools, trying to make them very intuitive, but nothing yet or nothing already that had to do with problem solving and knowledge creation as part of implementing.
Interesting. I think I came from a similar background. My original interest in critical rationalism actually comes from the utility it provides. So I want to have the most effective way to manage a business or my personal productivity. Once you figured out critical rationalism, did you have a similar boom, mind-blowing insight that a lot of what you knew was wrong or misguided?
Yes and no. You have this kind of intuitive connection rapidly with critical rationalism, like the recognition that, yeah, that's actually how we're thinking. We're actually taking seriously ideas, but then we're trying to discover mistakes. So one part was very intuitive, and also reminded me of my study field, which was physics, where because of experimentation and succession of ever better theories, you already intuitively feel, yeah, knowledge must grow in this kind of process of guessing something and then trying to improve it by error correction. But on the other hand, you have this also very ingrained bias or tradition or way of thinking that you want to seek for security and foundations and things you can believe in, things you want to defend so that they don't fall over. And it's like this conflict between both approaches in the beginning, where you recognize intuitively critical rationalism, but you're still fighting against it with this method which is more taught and more mainstream, which you get from education and from university more. And so this kind of battle between both was what was being kicked off from the beginning, and what propelled me and made me actually even more interested to figure out which of the two was actually the way in which knowledge grows.
Let's say we agree that knowledge creation is the most important faculty of an organization to focus on. So then, broadly speaking, how do we create an idea and improve an idea? And what is a better idea in your view?
Yeah, so here I'm following Popper, of course, as you know, but Popper says that all thinking starts from a problem. In the case of management, let's already be a bit more focused, because there's all kinds of problems, but here we're interested in management problems, which are basically what to do in order to improve a company situation or a team situation or even an individual situation in a company. So you start from a problem, like something you want to improve, but where you don't have the knowledge already about how to improve it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be even questioning the fact that the thing needs to be improved. So you require knowledge, you don't have it, and that's a problem. Second step is that you start guessing. You intuitively come up with approaches, potential actions, choices you can make that, if you would take them, could lead to this kind of improved situation that you have described in your problem and that you want to get to. But of course, the guesses, they come to you spontaneously and they need to be scrutinized. They need to be investigated. And that's the criticism phase, where you're going to take the other point of view, which is more, where can my guess be wrong? So what in that guess can cause a situation that I don't desire, that I don't want to end up in? And that's the criticism phase. So you're trying to look either by argument, so by a logical argument that if we execute the idea, this undesired consequence will follow and we don't want that. That's a criticism by argument. Or you do a criticism by test. You just run the idea, you're doing it, you're executing your idea, and you're trying to discover whether the outcome of the idea corresponds to your expectation. And if those two don't fit, you also discovered the mistake. You discovered an error. And then the last phase is where you're going to adapt the idea so these undesired consequences do not appear anymore. And that's like the 4-step process, starting from a problem, then going to guesses, criticizing the guess, and then adapting it.
You are also very good at trying to visualize these step processes and draw some boundaries so it's easier to talk about and also explain to other people. So I would love if you could share the process that you have laid out.
So if you want to get the kind of visual representation of how these 4 steps or this process works, we can go through it one by one. So as I said, you start by a problem. You define a problem, some situation that you find undesirable, that you want to get out to, a more desirable situation that you have in mind and where you want to get to, but you don't know yet how. Something is preventing you from realizing the improvement. That's what we call a root cause. And so part of the problem is understanding what is preventing you from achieving this improved situation and how this improved situation ideally would look like. So you start by defining the problem, and then intuitively, spontaneously, you are guessing what could be done in order for yourself to achieve that more desired situation. So you're going to set a goal, which is actually that situation where this root cause is gone or where the root cause is fixed, so that you achieve the improvement. And you have a set of choices and actions that you think need to be executed to achieve the goal. So that is basically the first step after defining a problem. And you know from experience that quite quickly you come up with at least one of such goals and ideas. Then what happens afterwards is that you take that idea and that goal very seriously and you explore all the criticisms of the idea. And the criticisms are the reasons or the facts that show undesired consequences. So that show the consequences that you don't like if you would execute upon the idea. And so you're going to start to list one under the other several undesired consequences. So effects of executing the idea that you don't want, that don't correspond to the goal or to the desired situation you want to get to. That's like the first move. It's like a vertical move, and it's linked to the first idea that you had in your mind for solving the problem. The second move is then, if you have discovered undesired consequences, that you're going to want to adapt the idea and so correct for the undesired consequences. You're going to modify, change, tweak, alternate some parts of the idea so the undesired consequences do not appear anymore. And so you will already have improved the idea. You will have an adapted idea that doesn't have the undesired consequence. Or it's also possible that you get stuck, that you don't find a way to correct for that specific undesired consequence. That's the second move. That's a horizontal one. But whenever you're stuck in an undesired consequences and you don't know how to adapt an idea, you can also, again, go, as we say, to vertically in the third move, where you're going to create even more alternative ideas when you're stuck, or complementary ideas that also add to the realization of the goal. And so in parallel to your first idea, you're going to start adding more and more ideas that are either alternative, if you're stuck on one of the ideas above, or complementary. And for each of those ones, you're going to do the same two moves again as you did in the first idea. So you're going to explore all kinds of criticisms for each of the ideas. So all reasons or facts that show undesired consequences. And you're going to try to eliminate the undesired consequence by adapting the idea. And so what you're seeing visually is that an idea doesn't grow in some kind of linear fashion, like as a small thing, and then it gradually adds and becomes better. It really grows, if you want, in a kind of two-dimensional way. So you're going to the right, you're going to the bottom, you're trying to find errors, and you're adapting the idea continuously so to avoid the error that you have detected. And so it's a kind of iterative process, non-linear, but which eventually makes your initial idea grow in many ways.
Very nice. I think it would be interesting to zoom in on a couple of the dimensions. For instance, what exactly constitutes a problem? I think Popper has a very specific definition of this. Is this also the one you think is useful in problem solving?
I think Popper's definition is a bit broad. So Popper says it's a conflict between ideas. So a problem could be the idea that you're feeling a sensation of hungriness and the idea that you feel satisfied and that you do not have any hunger anymore. That's a conflict, but nothing much more, like more specific definitions of a problem or constituents of a problem, which I prefer better in the context of a business situation, is to really go a little bit deeper into the description of the symptoms, like what is undesirable about the situation, a description of the root causes, what is causing those symptoms, like at a deeper level, after having asked a couple of times, why is the symptom there and why is the cause of the symptom there. So to get to a fairly deep level of root cause that is causing the undesired situation. And then thirdly, as a third aspect of a problem description, I think it's important also to specify the expectations. So how do you want to have the desired situation look like success criteria or descriptions for which, or criteria for which you want the solution to adhere to. And those are three specific descriptions which I think are very valuable in a problem description and go already a little bit more detailed than just saying it's a conflict between ideas.
Yeah, I agree. I think Popper is right that in our minds it is a conflict of two theories, of two ideas. However, it doesn't aid the problem-solving process usually to think of it this way. An undesired situation is probably sufficient to look for. And if I understand correctly, you're saying there's like your undesired situation at like a top level, then you examine the underlying root or causes, and then you focus on one root cause. So that's the second component you need. And the third one is indeed thinking of this goal or this this situation where this root cause is no longer there.
Correct. Yes.
Did I get it correct?
Yes. And for example, the distinction between a symptom or just a description of the undesired situation versus the root cause is necessary because your actions are going to affect the root cause. It's typically a bit superficial to try to remove the symptoms because they are quite superficial. They're like the immediate observations or the immediate sensation of undesiredness. You have to go a couple of steps deeper and figure out root causes because your actions are going to be all the more effective if they affect the root cause as opposed to only affecting a superficial symptom.
Right. Right. And if we take maybe an example from business, do you have an example in the top of your mind?
Yeah. Well, you can, for example, with customers, you can react at their, so to say, immediate reactions to, let's say you have a new product that you want to introduce to the market and you're collecting initial customer feedback. Like some of that feedback could be quite superficial or could be driven by, I don't have time to really invest whether I'm interested in this product, but from looking at first sight to it, it doesn't perform like we want to. That's superficial. That's kind of a symptom of the undesired situation that you're not managing to get this prospect excited or interested. But then the root cause is what you discover when you're asking more questions and when you're getting a little bit more time with the prospect. It could be that they have a kind of performance desire that competitive products already are offering and your new product, for example, does not. And this performance characteristic is like very important. That's what you will have to solve, either by exceeding that performance characteristic in some way or another, or by convincing them that other performance characteristics are at least as important or solve the problem at the side of the prospect at least as well as the one that they are focused on.
Then let's say we've found a root cause which we think is highly probable and the one we should really be focusing on. Why then is it still needed to define success criteria or a goal?
Yeah, so if you have success criteria, they serve as a means to criticize your ideas. If you have a specific outcome that you desire, let's say, other example, we're engaged in a cost reduction exercise. We want to remove the waste out of some particular process. And in terms of success criteria, we're saying like as a minimum 5% of the costs need to be reduced in the entire end-to-end process. So the 5% then is a specific measure to challenge your ideas with, because you will be coming up with various ideas in the in the third move. But not all of these ideas will meet the 5% criterion. And so the 5% success criterion is a way to criticize and challenge ideas, especially those ideas that manage to reduce costs only for 1 or 2%. And so that's how success criteria can, especially when they're specific, can really serve as a criticism to the ideas that you are generating.
Absolutely. And I guess a time frame is also a helpful criticism, because if you leave it too open-ended, like I want to get even a 5% cost reduction, that differs what your approaches or your ideas are going to be if you have 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years to solve that problem. So this is, I think, another reason why, at least in practice, it's very helpful to specify these success criteria. But I think another approach or mindset, and I think David Deutsch has also alluded to this, is that it's already constraining the solution that you're going to come up with. So therefore, it might be also less desirable to do this.
Yes, and that's a valid, of course, remark, and it can be partially solved by keeping your success criteria also flexible, and so improving your problem situation by improving the success criteria. It's obvious that if you're putting the success criteria like sky high and you're looking at an existing process that you want to improve for this sky high criterion, then obviously you will get stuck. And at some point you will have to improve your problem. And the problem with your problem at that stage is that your criterion is sky high. So both solutions improve via error correction, but problems do as well.
That also brings up an interesting question. Should we treat the problem and the goal throughout the knowledge creation process as fixed, or should they be mutable?
Well, I guess ideally they are mutable, because it would be justificationism to say that we have the perfect problem, or we have the correct problem, we have the right problem. Of course, in business, you have many forces that will say that problems need to have precise success criteria, and that the success criterion won't move an inch. It sometimes moves after a lot of failures and after a lot of pushing for a certain criterion that then eventually turns out to be not feasible. Then people are willing to change the criterion or loosen the criterion. But ideally, yes, you cannot say that you have found and justified the perfectly correct success criterion in your problem definition. So it's also important to be critical of that success criterion. But in a business setting, you will have to live with the fact that success criterions, success set, they typically tend to remain at their levels for quite some time.
I guess this ties back into the fact that even if we've defined this problem precisely as well as the success criterion, it means those are still fallible theories, right? Those are just conjectures. We have no direct access to reality, so we can never be certain of them. So therefore, we should assume those to also contain errors. But the important caveat is, if we change them, we should acknowledge it and also be open about the reasons for changing them and the criticisms behind it. Because otherwise we have the situation of moving goalposts, which is also very often occurs in business, where we just say, oh, no, now this is the goal. So then we lose track of everything we've done until that point in time.
Yeah, there is this, what's called the Goodhart law, that whenever a criterion becomes a target, it stops becoming a relevant criterion, because it will if you take a success criterion as infallibly true, and you're committing all your resources and choices to meeting a certain criterion, you're going to fail and suffer on other criteria because of this over focus on the infallibly correct and true one success criterion. So yeah, that's one way of being critical about problem situation, is not to think that there can be such a thing as a one correct and true success criterion, because if you do so, then you will introduce a lot of extra constraints on other success criteria that are also relevant in solving the problem.
Absolutely. Okay, so then moving on from the state of like the problem definition and the goal or the success criterion, we're gonna generate ideas. Do you have any experience or insight in like what typically companies would do or people would do when they are tasked with coming up with ideas, and maybe also allude to some of the common pitfalls in that process?
Yeah. So I like to think about an idea in the context of management, that it is a choice and a set of actions. Quite simple, but we tend to go away from that principle as well. Like a lot of the ideas are things like predictions. So people start predicting outcomes as part of the idea to solve a problem. But the prediction of an outcome is not an idea in the sense that, okay, I know what to choose and I know what to do. Like an idea should be an answer to a what to do next problem or a what to do next question. And in that sense, it's quite simple. There's a simple rule. It has to be a set of choices and a set of actions. That's an idea. And you of course criticize the idea, but already in terms of form or content, it needs to be actions and choices. And the way in which we avoid sticking to actions and choices is, for example, predictions, or which happens also a lot. We're only focused on an action and we are stressing the importance of the action. So we're talking more about how important an action is rather than what the action is, what it can lead to, why it leads to certain consequences. So that's also a mistake. Focusing only on goals, it's a bit related to focusing on prediction, but like just setting a goal is not solving a problem. You solve a problem by saying what to do and what to choose. So that's also a pitfall, saying what we shouldn't do. Because when you say we shouldn't do X, you're not solving a problem. Like solving the problem is saying what to do. Of course, being critical of it and trying to improve it, but at least it has to be something to do and something to choose. So in the case of a cost reduction, answers could be like, we should remove the resources committed to this production task, or we should renegotiate the input costs with our suppliers. But those are all like actions or choices. And so it's not predicting what will come out, or it's not saying what we shouldn't be doing, or it's not iterating the importance of the cost reduction exercise. The idea is literally the set of things to do and the choices to make in the situation you're in, and the situation that has to have these cost reduction.
Yeah. So if our goal is to reduce cost by 5%, is it sufficient that an action and an idea is just implicitly going to amount to that? So if you just say, let's do this and that, and by that you imply it's going to contribute to that 5% goal, is that sufficient, or should there be an explanatory component to the ideas and actions that we formulate?
Yes, you need to have the explanatory component, otherwise you can't criticize. So it is an action already. So like strictly speaking, it is part of a solution by saying we should do this. But you're only going to figure out whether that is wrong by first explaining what the action will have as consequences on the cost levels, and then criticizing those consequences. Like saying or coming up with reasons why it won't be that much of a cost reduction for this and this and this other reason. Then you're in the criticism part, but you need the explanation of what the action will cause to be in a position to criticize it.
I think this is the same difference between the era of when we had rule of thumb knowledge as our primary set of knowledge and our explanatory knowledge, which happened since the Enlightenment, that became our main means of knowledge and scientific discovery and progress. Meaning that rules of thumb, they don't really have an explanation. They just say, do this and this and this, and therefore their reach is limited and their range of applicability is limited. Hence, the explanatory ones are superior because those are allow themselves to be criticized and improved over time. Is the same concept when we're talking about business idea generation? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And knowing that rules of thumbs can solve problems. That's the reason why they ever got created and got so popular. But typically we have new problems. And so rules of thumbs typically don't solve the new problem anymore, because the consequences of rules of thumbs do not adhere anymore with our new expectations in new problems. That is somewhat logical, but they are effectively solutions to problems, rules of thumb. But typically we're faced with unique problems, ever new problems, and then all actions that we're suggesting need to be explained in terms of what we think they will cause and whether or not those causes fit with the problem expectation or not.
And when we're talking about business, of course, there are some of the problems which are like genuinely new. We don't have an idea of what we're going to do. Like if we want to create a new product line, that is genuine new knowledge creation in the sense that we cannot really look for examples in our history or competitors. But a lot of the other problems in business also require new knowledge. But that's because every problem is super context dependent. There's just so many unique variables to your problem situation that you have to incorporate.
And I also don't have a problem with starting with a rule of thumb as a candidate solution. I mean, if you remember the diagram, if we were to start with like a rule of thumb, rather quickly it would already start adapting. It would already start improving in the two directions that you can improve it. So it's not a problem to start with a rule of thumb as a guess or a conjecture. Of course, it's a problem when you're trying to justify that is then already the solution.
Yes. So then moving on to the criticism step, in your framework, there is you criticize it based on both if it will actually have the desired outcome or therefore contribute to your success criterion, but also if it will have side effects or undesired consequences that actually create more problems down the line. So these are two modes of criticism that you have. How did you come up with those two methods or those two modes of criticism?
Yeah, predictable answer, but it's all in Popper. Popper describes he calls it the logic of situation and the logic of action, and he stresses the idea that all actions, of course, have infinite consequences. Some of those consequences are the ones that we desire. Those will correspond with our goal, with our aim, but a lot of those consequences will not correspond to what we desire and will not correspond to the goal. And it's those ones that we try to first identify, but then also remedy. And we want to adapt our ideas so the undesired consequences do not occur anymore. And so we correct it for an undesired consequences through an improved idea. And so, yes, it's the both modes. We of course want to get to the desired consequences, like those need to be fulfilled, let's say, as a minimum condition. But then we also want to reduce for the number of undesired consequences.
Right. And also the undesired consequences come from sub-criteria, I guess, that we could constrain the problem with, meaning it should not cost more than this, or it should not be take more than this time to implement, because then you will have undesired consequences if you go over that limit, and therefore, I guess, compromising the quality of the idea.
I don't think you have to have all of them already listed in the problem. You can discover undesired consequences just by pure reason, by deducing what would happen if we just go out there and we do this. You will come up with many consequences that you may not have thought about already as criteria for good solutions. So both can be. I'm always in favor of leaving it quite open and just not limiting ourselves to stop looking for undesired consequences. Of course, there's a point where it doesn't make sense to keep on going, but it's also merits a lot to take enough time and to just freely and openly list undesired consequence after undesired consequence, but with an argumentation, of course, or via a test, not like randomly prophesying undesired consequences. It has to be with some minimum logic to it. That can go on for quite some time. There's no need to restrict or restrain yourself from exploring those set of consequences.
No, although you could go on infinitely into the most tedious of details of an action. And we also know individuals in business who are just very critical, which is often a great trait. But from an economics perspective, just the opportunity costs are not worth that extra criticism. Do you have a heuristic to know when you cut off the process or when you've gone far enough?
Yeah, so you're fully right that every action has infinite consequences. So you never get done and you never reach all of them. That's clear. But then I'm thinking back about what you said just a minute ago. Then the heuristic could be a good problem description, because then effectively in the problem, once it's a good one, it will tell you already which undesired consequences to look for, i.e. the ones that have nothing to do with your success criterion or with your expectation. So the better you formulate the expectation, I guess the more focused you can run the search for undesired consequence. But it's a very good point that in principle, they're infinite. So you have to have an economic way to spend time allocating your time searching for them.
Another nuance that I always like to stress is you cannot come up with all of the criticism also just through theory. So there's also a phase where you're gonna have to start implementing your theorized idea and then see if it fits within the broader context. Because the complexity of especially businesses, big operations, lots of people involved, you're likely not going to be able to think about or project the exact context in which those will all fall in. So it's also worthwhile to just experiment to start. Do you have a thought on like when that moment should occur and how that reflection should happen?
Well, that's what we are doing with these real exercises in clients is we're planning the criticism, because exactly at any given time, you cannot even in principle come up with all the potential undesired consequences, because you have to say one thing, execute the idea minimally to be able to detect what goes wrong and what is undesired. But you can plan for the detection of a criticism. Typically, the ID has an implementation plan, and you will start implementing various phases in the ID. But according to those phases, you also have to plan, again, the critical exercise, because you'll have a lot of information from the field, from doing the thing, from collecting the reactions and the feedback if it's to do with a customer. And so you'll be in a much better position to identify the undesired consequences after running a significant part of the idea and the actions, and then plan a criticism again to adapt and go further, as opposed to thinking that you can predict all these things, let's say at the moment where you're going to do the big launch of the program or of the initiative.
Yeah. So is it also correct that the 4 moves, they continue throughout the execution implementation process? You don't stop the criticism, but you're more like, okay, now we've done the theoretical criticism part. We're moving on to the criticism part where the feedback we get from execution is going to influence our criticism.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So execution is just a better problem than a strategy problem. All problems eventually evolve into ever better problems and different problems. So I don't see a real distinction between solving a problem and executing the solution. They're both problem-solving exercises. They're both about making choices. They're both about having multiple possible ideas and figuring out which idea is worse than another. Whether that is in implementing and having ideas about removing barriers to make progress, or whether it is in the purely problem-solving phase where it is about ideas about the big directions to go in, which are the worst directions versus the better direction. Both of those phases are problem-solving and involve everything from problem definition to guessing to criticizing to adaptation. Of course, again, in the typical company context, people will want to have this clear separation, purely for purposes of being able to tell we are now in the strategy or the thinking phase, and we are now already in the implementation phase. But I find these distinctions a bit harmful and artificial, especially in the implementation phase. Thinking that all problem solving is done is very harmful, because problems are inevitable, and problems will definitely occur during implementation. So there's no reason to like leave the problem phase behind and just launch into execution or implementation with the idea that no creativity or no criticism is needed anymore. On the contrary,
Absolutely.
actually.
Yeah. I personally come from more the software business world, and that's also a realization that's been made a long time ago, that you cannot pre-plan or theorize all the problems you have to solve in advance. It's better to use the iterative approach where you do your best in the short term. Like the Scrum method follows this broadly, where you have a sprint, like a 2-week increment where you plan your work for. And then after the 2 weeks, you get more data, and it can, of course, then refine your next week's plan and look back at your goals in the bigger picture. So this iteration, I think, is not too controversial. It's just difficult to think of it as really a proactive problem-solving process that's just continuously ongoing. I think that's not intuitive for a lot of people.
Yeah, software development is an interesting example. There's many more. So it's worth saying that, of course, in business, we have, to a large extent, we adopt this critical attitude. Like, we're doing proof of concept, we're doing trials, we're doing pilots, we're doing sprints. All of these things are to some extent geared to discover mistakes. Like at the end of a sprint, at the end of a pilot, at the end of a proof of concept, you're going to try to figure out what is unsatisfactory, etc. But it is only this one way of criticism, which Popper explains. It's the criticism by testing things. There is another way to criticize the same ideas, which is a criticism from counter-argument, where you do not have to launch in execution or in pilots or in proof of concept, but you can just, by using reason and arguments, you can explain and argue for an undesired consequence, just simply by coming up with reasons and arguments. And that is, I think, still very much underutilized in companies. I think it has a bigger error correction potential than the tests. It is also something that doesn't require any resources for long periods of time, which are required in tests, which costs money, obviously. So criticism by counter argument is one, very effective, and two, doesn't require a lot of mobilization and resources and energy and efforts. And I do think that companies have a tendency, when they engage in critical attitudes and behaviors, that they fully go for this kind of criticism by testing, but they completely underutilize the potential of criticism by counter argument.
Yeah, I think it's also largely part because criticism by testing is super tangible and easy to report on. So you can say, yes, we've tried this pilot of this amount of weeks, these were the costs, and this is the forecasted results of it. And that's nice to have on your slide deck to present and track, etc. Or I think this leads us to also an interesting mindset, which is the common fallacies or wrong ways that we see problem solving occurring in organizations. And I think you also have some visuals to aid in that.
Yep. Yes. So it's interesting, of course, to think about the flip side or the opposite of the kind of problem solving that we have been discussing. So what are we typically doing that is not Popperian problem solving, that is not this kind of error correction way of growing knowledge? The start is still the same. So we still start from a problem. There's something that is undesirable, but then we set a goal and we have this kind of idea that we really think will solve the problem. And so the flip side of Popperian problem solving is what I call defending an idea. So you are coming up with this idea in orange, and you're going to want to defend the idea and make sure that that is the one that will survive everything and that will be eventually selected for implementation and as solution of the problem. So how do we typically do that? Is we're building a foundation below that idea that should justify the idea as a true idea, the best idea, better than any other idea we can think of. And this foundation is all these kinds of arguments that are saying why that particular idea is the best, is better. And there's many ways to build a foundation, and we always do combinations of the many ways, but we can say this idea is better because the data are showing it. So we pull up graphs and we make predictions of what would happen if we implement this idea, and these predictions show very attractive growth curves. So the data are showing that this is the idea that is better than any other one. Another way is saying that the idea is better because it has all these kinds of positive aspects, like the people will love it, the customers will like it, the cash is well preserved, like all kind of positive arguments for an idea that we are throwing in there as a foundation. Other even, alternative ways of building a foundation is saying that your idea is in line with very important foundational principles, like the importance of putting the customer first, or being climate friendly in all your solutions, or being cash focused, or growth focused, or innovation focused, like foundational principles. And look, my idea is fully in line with these foundational principles that we all agree are so important. And then a last way to build a foundation is also a very common one, is you can refer to the authority who came up with the idea. My boss has said that this is the idea we should be implementing. So my boss has this authority, and authority needs to be respected. Hence, this idea is better than any other idea.
Or even this method that I read from this book is amazing. So that becomes then the authority. This other resource that you apparently have seen be very successful. It takes many forms, of course. We justify a approach by association very regularly.
Yes, exactly. And so these 4 ways are ways to build like a foundation for this one idea that you definitely want to justify to be the idea that will solve the problem that everybody should follow and that should be accepted. That is the flip side of what we have been discussing, is taking an idea and trying to improve it by criticizing it. As opposed to doing that, you're just building a foundation underneath it so it cannot sink through the floor, and that it is preserved and immutable and will eventually be accepted because of this solid foundation that we built underneath the idea. Now, there's a big problem with the foundation. Basically, that none of the aspects of a foundation for an idea can be a proof that you actually have the correct idea or the best idea or an idea that is better than any other. Because, and that's a simple logical argument, even better ideas than the one that you want to build the foundation for, those will have even better data, those will come with the same or even better positive aspects or positive traits. Those can have the same or even more important foundational principles. So the fact that your great idea doesn't correspond to a foundational principle is not an argument that a better idea does not do so equally. And lastly, it can also come from an even more authoritative source. So if you say we need to do this idea because it comes from an expert with 30 years experience, if another expert says something else and he has 35 years of experience, that could already be a blow to your foundation. In any case, the number of years of experience cannot have any influence on the truth or the quality of the content of an idea. So the whole appeal to authority part of building a foundation is really problematic. But all the other 3 parts are problematic as well, since none of those ways of building a foundation under an idea and defending your idea as the best have any proof for the fact that they are actually the better ones. And so what is the result of that is that all the time that you spend in building the foundation and defending a particular idea is time that could be spent on other things and is basically a waste of time, all the while that the idea that you came up with very early on is not even improving. You're keeping the idea fixed and immutable. It cannot change because you're building the foundation under it. So the idea doesn't improve. And then worst of all, other people in the room or other people on the team, they are doing exactly the same. They're building foundations for conflicting ideas because they may have other ideas. They may think, no, we shouldn't be doing your idea. We should do something else. That'll solve the problem. And so they are building their foundation as well, wasting time equally in the same redundant way, also not improving their idea. And so you're creating an increased conflict by building these foundations, by trying to keep your idea immutable and defend it with other people that have opposing ideas.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to note that it's not like there is no merit in arguments based on data or positive traits of the idea or even some principles and authorities, but those should be criticisms. They should be formulated as criticisms to an idea, not as a anchor point or what's it called, a moat around the idea or really a defensive barrier, because that's just falling into the wrong game. Like you said, that you're just wasting time. You're not doing anything which has to do with knowledge creation anymore. You're just defending ideas and beliefs and attacking other people's ideas and beliefs rather than taking an idea seriously based on its contents and criticizing the contents openly. So I think underlying here is the epistemological difference, right, between I guess critical rationalism on the one side and all other forms of justificationism on the other.
Yeah, exactly. And I've came to coin this first way of thinking, rapid idea improvement. And that's actually what's happening when you're not defending an idea. When you're not defending an idea, you don't want it to change, you don't want it to improve. Whereas as you engage in criticism and in adaptation of ideas so that they survive the criticism, then you're actually improving the idea. And there's also a way to do it rapidly because you can organize sessions and make leeway and speed in these different moves. Already visually, you're seeing that your idea is growing. It's growing to the right and it's growing to the bottom. And so you can achieve rapid idea improvement. And it's actually also very engaging. If you do it in teams, then you feel a kind of like vibe and flow emerging from this, because you're really focusing on ideas, on consequences that could follow from them, even better ideas that avoid undesired consequences. You're really like into making this idea better in all kinds of ways, as opposed to like forcing yourself to come up with the perfect defense and the perfect foundation, whereas we know that such a thing cannot exist.
And going into that, the human aspect of the problem solving, do you also make a point to note the source of an idea or an owner of an idea? Or is that not important and actually should be deprioritized?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I'm a little bit still in between. One thing which is really important is that an improved idea has been improved typically by various sources. Like there are the people that come up with the alternative version of the ideas. There's the people that come up with the undesired consequences and the criticisms. And then there's people, now I'm speaking when you do this in teams. And then there's the people that come up with the adaptations to the ideas. So when you're looking at this two-dimensional variation and growing of ideas, it's almost impossible to pinpoint who did exactly contribute what, and so who should be credited or responsible with this idea. So the longer I've been doing this, the more I go away from this idea of having like ownership on an idea. What I believe more in is that you have to own the improvement of an idea, and so that you are capable of bringing people together to engage in such an exercise of rapid idea improvement with these various stages and these various dynamics that you apply to ideas, and you're responsible for the idea improvement, as opposed to being, whenever we make people responsible of ideas, naturally they're going to want to defend it. Because if you own something, you don't want it to change. You want it to be protected, survive all kinds of evolutions. And so there is this mistaken idea that when you own an idea, that it should not change anymore. On the contrary, it should rapidly improve.
And also you might feel just a need to defend that idea in general. You don't want to have the idea that turned out to be not a great action to contribute to our success criterion. So yeah, I do think making it a team effort to criticize ideas is a great idea. Are there any other ways we can encourage this type of problem-solving mindset within organizations? Because this is, of course, a large part of your daily job, is you're trying to teach this very novel method to people who are not used to it. What have you noticed is a good way to encourage this mode of thinking, this Popperian problem-solving approach?
Yeah, I think we have to explain how knowledge can grow, as opposed to this other way where knowledge is being defended and prohibited from growing. And that is the first step, like explaining how this works. Like with for example, the 2 slides that I've shown, that's typically how I start. And then quickly I'm launching into a concrete problem, like not a theoretical one, not like a very famous problem from outside the context of a company. No, a real situation with a real problem inside the company. I typically work on commercial problems or on operational efficiency problems. So any of those two with sales teams or operational teams, we can quite quickly engage in. And then it's up to learning by doing. So we have all the, what I've shown, we have it in tools where people can use and follow steps, and we organize problem-solving sessions around the problems and then follow up and manage and plan the improvement of the idea. So very quickly it gets very tangible and real. But yeah, the start is just like explaining the difference between knowledge that is prevented from growing and knowledge that is capable of being grown.
And once an organization has adopted this principle, do you also see certain benefits to the individuals in the organization and the organization at large in terms of the results they produce?
Yeah. So what you typically see in the evolution of people that go along in this is that you have like a two-step realization. Like first, people can be a little bit afraid or even intimidated because you're asking them to question things. So it's not about executing things that are already established in terms of how they should be executed. So Initial reaction could be things like, why do we need to change, or why do we need to question all of this? We've been doing this for so long. And then gradually, like when they start to discover like the improvements themselves, obviously then the engagement starts rising, and the almost kind of relief, because I mean, there's a lot of implicit knowledge in people, in companies, that is underutilized if you don't serve them problems, and which can be really, let's say, liberated when you have these people in such kind of process. And then eventually that's really a sense of relief that they have, because they can finally apply this knowledge that has been there all along, but that hasn't yet been given the chance to be applied to a problem and to progress. So yeah, that's like the two dynamics that I'm seeing. And most, if not all, people go through both phases, because people my belief is that people, they want improvement, they want to seek for improvement, and they want to be critical even about certain things, and engage in critical debate and discussion, and try to pursue better stages. So that's eventually that's a positive dynamic that you can bring into that.
It creates a bit more of a dynamic environment in the teams and individuals. Is that fair to say? Because I can imagine that in larger organizations, you really have confined roles and execution scripts that people have to follow. But this might give back some freedom to organizations.
Yeah, definitely. And also knowing that having to engage in this kind of defending of your idea is also very frustrating and tiring for people. Yeah, because you're getting constant attacks, and you have to always be able to save an existing that cannot improve, an existing idea that cannot improve anymore. So you're fighting also a battle that you can't win. Eventually, if you can't improve the idea, then the defense of the idea will suffer as well. And that's also wearing people down. And this approach remediates a bit of that kind of dynamic.
Do you feel like you've been having success with the companies that you've worked with and the teams you've worked with implementing this approach? You see lasting change?
Yeah, definitely. And even engagement as well of people. Like at the end, I often get the remarks that, why can't we continue? Why can't we do it on more problems? And this is really a sustainable kind of dynamic where people become more cooperative, where the barriers between departments are gradually going down, and where, literally they start suggesting, can we do more of this? A condition for that is that we're obviously talking about ideas and taking ideas seriously and how they can be improved. That the momentum can quickly be spoiled once we're starting to talk too much about people and ad hominem and the blame game. And so it's a crucial condition when you're engaged in these processes, that you're setting up these kinds of rules, that it's not about finding who to blame or attributing undesired situations to behaviors of people and all those kinds of things. It's about actions and choices, what the consequences of those actions and choices to a situation can be, everything we discussed, but it's at the level of ideas. And once you manage to keep people focused on that, they will get engaged about it, because that's actually interesting. That understanding how stuff works and understanding how stuff works better than other stuff is engaging by nature. But it can obviously be a bit dampened by this kind of interpersonal kind of discussion, which you have to isolate from the process.
Even argue it's quite freeing to realize, okay, we're not talking about individuals, and you don't have to be personally attacked or defensive, because we're just talking about ideas, and those ideas, we do not care where they come from. We only care about their substance in the form of their contents and how good the explanations are. So you don't have to worry about who came up with the idea or who came up with the criticisms. I guess that would make me feel a lot more safe to actually engage in this environment.
Yeah, exactly. And even an action, which is the cause of an idea, is also not the same as a person. So you can perfectly well discuss actions and their consequences without having to talk about the particular person that performs the action and the kind of personality that that person has. That those are all irrelevant subjects when you're discussing an action.
Yeah. Do you think we're still early to the critical rationalism ification of the world and problem solving?
interesting question. As I said, a lot of the mainstream approaches already have a lot of critical thinking in them. Like Agile is very much based on a critical attitude. So critical rationalism and the way of making progress has found its way already to some extent into business. It's not like a dreadful initial situation we're faced in. I do think that there's obviously way more room for expansion, and notably with what I've mentioned, like criticism by argument or counter argument has way more potential. Like we don't like it, we're a bit afraid of it, we think it's too negative, or it's not tangible, as you said, or not measurable. And that's maybe a reason why this mode of criticism hasn't really fully found its way. Also, we want to defend our, so why would we counter argue against them? So there's a lot of barriers still that preventing that mode of criticism to really be more mainstream, let's say, in business. But the critical method via testing, I guess has made some ways already, and that's good. But
That's true.
There's always more to explore for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're like the world at large is largely, if we had to assign one epistemology, maybe instrumentalism is the one we're most like aligned with. At least we all care about the results or the impacts of ideas and knowledge creation, and we know that iteration is a way to get better results and improve upon that. But like the conscious awareness of the explanatory mechanism of why something is good, so not rule of thumb, but actual explanation. That is something we still need to, I think, nurture more and understand more and spread the message on more.
Yeah, exactly.
So we've covered this problem-solving framework, but we can dive into some other related or maybe unrelated topics that I know that you're interested in and have been working on. So you have this TED Talk about the flow state, and I'm just curious what do you think as a critical rationalist, what that kind of is and how that fits into the problem-solving process?
Yeah, so this is a concept I bumped into before Popper and Deutsch. It's the flow state, this psychological state of optimum performance, where you're feeling completely engaged in your activity and you're forgetting about time and any other emotion. You're just purely focused on the task at hand. Already in 2012 or so, I became very interested in it, but based on the work of this Hungarian psychologist with a difficult name, he formulated 3 conditions for experiencing flow. So it has to do with the balance between the difficulty of your task and then how good you are at it already. So tasks need to be slightly more different than your current skill level, and that gets you like really into it and wanting to pursue. I never fully managed to make the bridge with critical rationalism, but I think they're very, very much related. I think your ideas are rapidly improving when you're in a flow state. And so you're rapidly criticizing them, adapting them for the sake of progress, and then progress that you are experiencing. And that gives you this psychological positive emotion. So intuitively, there must be many, many connections between how knowledge grows versus what the psychological state of flow is. Maybe funnily, I bumped into both concepts, or not funnily, but like relatedly.
Yeah.
But I haven't really bridged them entirely.
You also have a big interest in economics and the various theories that are available. With Austrian economics, I think is the most aligned with the critical rationalism epistemology. Is that the case? And if so, like what makes you drawn to that?
Yes, I think it's definitely the most aligned with critical rationalism. So the basic idea behind Austrian economics is that we can explain what happens in an economy because of actions of individuals, because they want to pursue goals. So in the critical rationalist framework, we would say that individuals create explanations for what action to pursue in order to get them to a goal that they rank very high and very valuable. And so, yeah, that is the link between explanations and economic action, whether it is engaging in a productive action or a consumption action or a savings actions. Any kind of economic action can be explained by explanations. And yeah, that got myself immediately attracted and interested to this kind of methodological way of treating economics, as opposed to the instrumentalist way, which you see in all the more mainstream economic schools, which is coming up with a mathematical model that should predict the economy, but completely detached from real actions, real choices, real objectives and goals of the people that constitute the economy. So the instrumentalist methodologies, they were like dismissed out of hand very quickly. And then I discovered this kind of more realism, explanation based, or with a much stronger link to explanations, which is the Austrian school. And that was the kickstart.
Interesting. So I believe the Austrian economics are agnostic to exactly which explanations an individual has for making economic decisions or enacting economic actions. However, they acknowledge that those reasons are there and the market is there to structure this process. Am I saying this correctly?
Yeah, no, that's correct. They would say that we have like a hierarchy of values, like goals that we want to reach. And what we're doing is we're choosing the action to satisfy or that will bring us to our most highly valued goals. But they're not going into the psychological part to explain why do we put this goal at the highest level and the one that we want to achieve. So that's outside of it. But like they assume that we have this preference ranking and that we are allocating our own resources, which is the performance of an action. We're allocating those resources according to the highest valued ends or goals that we want to meet.
What exactly do the other instrumentalist theories say is driving the actions of individuals? If not this, what do they focus on?
They will typically I think mathematize the human being and saying that they're either all rational and possess all information and make the rationally most optimal decision, or some like the behavioral economics strand will then say that emotion also plays some role in some way, but always with the idea that you can mathematize it, that you can put it in a model, homogenize actions as the same for big groups of people, and then you can start performing calculations and making predictions based on the calculations. So the goal is always to end up with a mathematical model. So they go away from these kind of realistic concepts of a goal, an action, a time to perform an action, the result of an action, the consequence of an action. That's like terminology that is not in those methods.
So they're more about generalizing and trying to predict patterns and showing how that will then lead to other predictions in future states.
Yes, and they do that so at the level of the individuals, but then also at the level of like sectors in the economy. They all have to go to an equilibrium position, so they all sort of have to become the same and do the same and earn the same profit. And everybody has full knowledge of all information and all changes, so there cannot be any disruptions, not any unexpected deviation from the course towards zero profits and 100% equilibrium. All these kinds of I would say mathematical tricks that are needed in order to be able to end up with a model that then can deliver you the predictions.
Completely different topic, but we've also spoken about personality and personality tests in the past. What are your current views on this concept that there are different personality types in individuals and we could take a test and know what we are and then base our life actions and morality based on that?
Yeah, so I'm completely against them, against personality tests or the idea that there could be something of an essence in a person and that a test can reveal this kind of essence through the use of some characterization or some number. I think individuals create new ideas all the time in the face of new problems, and we can have conflicting ideas at any moment in the same mind. We can have ideas that are strong appeals to being structured and rational, whereas we can also have ideas that are more wild and open and following our drives and our intuitions. And those can be in the same mind at the same time trying to solve the same problem. Whereas such a personality test would need to know that there's only one type of ID consistently in the same mind. And that it is then that ID that can get a number and that can represent the characterization of who you are. So I don't buy the entire thing. And I think it's also a little bit dehumanizing to like approximate people in terms of numbers and in terms of the typical ideas that they will always have in their minds in given situations. No, we have unpredictable ideas. We have multiple conflicting ideas at any stage in time. We can improve any of those multiple conflicting ideas at any time. Yeah, from the get-go, I'm well, how do you say it? Completely against it.
I share the view. Let's acknowledge that even if it could accurately determine like our personality, it would just be at one specific time frame and one specific context. It doesn't acknowledge that in different contexts we completely behave differently. Like we can be introverted in some cases, but completely extroverted in other cases. It also puts us in a box which we cannot improve upon over time because we're this one color type. And next week or next year, when we've learned some new insights, it doesn't matter because we're still this old type. And I think a last argument or a nail in the coffin is that whenever you take these personality tests, 99% of them are all positive traits. They're just positive traits packaged in some different composition with a nice little person behind it and some examples of what they do. It's just meant for everybody to feel good. If it was actually mapping a personality, it would be honest about shortcomings and like things you're not doing well and which are like morally or objectively unhelpful behaviors.
Yeah, exactly.
I think only can lead to some kind of deterministic thinking pattern where you limit yourself and therefore don't try to improve because you're this way. I share the view we should get rid of that in daily thinking and be more focused on human creativity and knowledge creation, which I think is a good segue to the last question, which I wanted to ask you about, and that is in daily life, when you're just going about your trivial everyday problems, do you also find yourself thinking in terms of the Popperian problem-solving cycle?
I must say more and more so, because obviously when you're reading into this and try to develop approaches, then you're going to, by some kind of spontaneous way, adopt it. And yes, I find myself in even the simplest of situations, more develop the reflex of what could be an alternative choice, what could be also the explanation for something I'm faced with, something I don't understand, something I need to resolve. And so I guess it's been gradually growing on me that there are always multiple ideas in the mix in your mind, and even all of them have the potential to improve. And I work with it on a daily basis. Yeah, it's been growing on me, so to say, and it's useful and valuable even for the simplest of problems. It doesn't matter how complex or complicated a problem is. There are always multiple ideas and there are always multiple criticisms, and there is always potential for progress by considering multiple ideas and considering criticism. And that's just also fun. I mean,
absolutely,
that's fun to look at situations in this kind of more open and varied way.
Well, Bart, thank you very much. I really enjoyed speaking with you today, and I've also always enjoyed our conversations about creating this problem-solving process and making it more public, trying to bring more attention to it and popularize the Popperian approach to knowledge creation. So thank you for all the conversation in the past and also this podcast episode. I think people will enjoy it a lot.
Thank you very much. Also enjoying your work a lot, and this was fun.
Yes, it was fun. Thank you, Bart. Have a good one. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Bart as much as I did. If you're curious to learn more about Bart's problem-based management approach, I recommend reading his paper. He also continues to publish new episodes of the Seeking Good Explanations podcast. You can find links to both in the description. If you'd like to hear more interviews like this, please consider subscribing, and see you in the next episode.